The summons came on a rain-slick morning in February 1945. Forrest Frederick Edward Yeo-Thomas, the White Rabbit of the Special Operations Executive, stepped through the iron gates of 64 Wars, Baker Street, headquarters of Britain's secret wartime agency. The air in London was still heavy with the smell of coal and cordite. Peace felt close, but not yet earned. Inside, the corridors hummed with typewriters, the clack of Morse keys, and the subdued murmur of voices behind closed doors. Everyone knew that Europe was entering its final act, but no one could say how bloody the finale would be. Yeo-Thomas, still thin from his recent escape from Buchenwald, wore a dark civilian suit and the kind of expression only the war could carve. His right wrist bore faint scars from shackles. His eyes, deep-set and vigilant, never rested long on any one face. "White Rabbit," said Maurice Buckmaster, head of the SOE's French section, motioning him inside. "We need you again." Buckmaster's tone carried both admiration and guilt. Few had suffered as Yeo-Thomas had. Captured by the Gestapo, beaten, waterboarded, sent to a death camp, and yet he was one of the few who made it out alive. "I thought my usefulness ended in Buchenwald," Yeo-Thomas said dryly. Buckmaster slid a folder across the table. It bore a red label stamped "Most Secret." Inside were reconnaissance photographs, aerial images of Berlin, a city flattened into gray dust and shadow. The Reich was collapsing, but inside those ruins, deals were being made. The Germans are cracking. There are senior officers, Wehrmacht, even SS, who want to talk, Buckmaster said. They'll surrender to the British or the Americans, not the Soviets? And you think I can get them out? Yeo-Thomas asked. "You're the only one who can get in," Buckmaster replied. The mission was as mad as it was vital. Parachute into the outskirts of Berlin, infiltrate the surviving intelligence networks, and make contact with German officers ready to defect. Britain wanted their documents, their knowledge, and, if possible, their loyalty, before Stalin's armies reached the city's heart. Yeo-Thomas flipped through the pages, photos of crumbling streets, coded messages intercepted by Bletchley, fragments of names, Canaris, Galen, von Gersdorf. The old Germany was dying, but even in death, it had secrets worth stealing. He looked up. "I assume the Soviets don't know about this." "They mustn't," Buckmaster said. "They'll see every man in Berlin as an enemy, including you." A faint smile crossed Yeo-Thomas's face. "Then it's just like old times." That night at a small airfield in Harrington, he watched the ground crew load a Lysander aircraft. His gear was minimal. Forged papers under the name Frederick Delaunay, a radio set small enough to fit in a briefcase, a cyanide pill hidden in a matchbox, and a thin silver cigarette case engraved with the initials F.F.E, a gift from a woman he once loved in Paris, long before the war made sentiment a liability. The pilot, a young RAF man barely 20, handed him a parachute pack. "Berlin?" he asked, incredulous. "Somebody has to go," Yeo-Thomas replied. At 22:40, the plane lifted into the moonlit dark, slicing through the cold night air over Europe's broken spine. Yeo-Thomas stared out the window. Below, the lights of the continent glimmered faintly through the smoke. Cities he'd once known by name were now smoldering ruins. At 01:17, they crossed the Elbe River. The city loomed ahead, half dead, half burning. Berlin, the capital of the Reich, the center of madness, was now a skeleton haunted by searchlights. "Time to jump," the pilot shouted. Yeo-Thomas pulled down his goggles, tightened his harness, and stepped into the freezing void. For a moment, the war was silent. No gunfire, no engines, only the rush of wind. Then the parachute opened with a violent jerk, and the city of Hitler's empire rose beneath him, blackened and vast. He landed in a cratered field near Grunewald Forest, his boots sinking into cold mud. Distant thunder echoed, the sound of Russian artillery edging closer each night. The mission had begun. He buried his parachute, adjusted his false papers, and whispered under his breath, "Let's see what secrets your city still keeps, Herr Hitler." The city smelled of ash and fear. Forrest Yeo-Thomas moved through Grunewald as the gray dawn broke over Berlin. Smoke from distant shell fire drifted through the trees like ghostly fog. The air was brittle with winter, the ground frozen and scarred with tank tracks. The distant boom of Soviet artillery rolled closer each morning, the Red Army tightening its noose. He carried nothing that tied him to London. His French identity papers listed him as Frederick Delaunay, textile merchant, evacuated from Paris. His overcoat bore a subtle SOE modification, a hidden pocket sewn into the lining, where a small cyanide capsule lay between two stitched seams. His radio was wrapped in a tattered cloth inside an old briefcase. In his pocket, a folded scrap of paper carried the addresses of 3 men who might still be alive. Former Abwehr officers who had once secretly opposed Hitler. Every corner of Berlin was now an accusation. Bombed-out apartments leaned over the streets like broken teeth. Windows were boarded, streets deserted except for a few civilians dragging carts of salvaged wood. Posters still clung to the walls, Sieg oder Tod, victory or death, though most were half-burned or smeared with soot. He passed a group of Hitler youth, boys no older than 16, armed with Panzerfausts. Their faces were thin, eyes too bright. They saluted him as he passed. He gave a curt nod and kept walking, careful not to draw attention. His first contact was an address scrawled on that folded note, Bleibtreustrasse 11. According to Buckmaster's file, an engineer named Ernst von Langen had once worked under Admiral Canaris in the Abwehr before the Gestapo purges. If he'd survived, he might hold the key to bringing other officers into contact with the Allies. Yeo-Thomas found the building half collapsed, a corner torn open by a direct hit. He climbed through the rubble, his boots crunching on glass. In what was once a parlor, a small stove still burned. A woman in a shawl looked up, startled. "Ich suche Herrn von Langen," he said in careful German. "I have business from Paris." She eyed him warily. "He doesn't live here anymore. Taken last year." "Gestapo!" Her voice dropped. "No one sees him now. Dead or in a camp. Another ghost." He thanked her, stepped outside and leaned against the wall, breathing in the cold air. Every trail was fading. The Gestapo had torn through their own intelligence services months ago, purging anyone who dared doubt the Führer. And yet, somewhere in this city, Yeo-Thomas believed, there were men waiting, Wehrmacht officers, diplomats, intelligence analysts, who wanted to surrender before Berlin became a furnace. That night, he made contact with a courier from the Kreisau Circle, a remnant of the old resistance that had backed Klaus von Stauffenberg's failed assassination attempt on Hitler. They met in the ruins of a church near Charlottenburg, its roof blown away, the altar buried under stone. The courier, a gaunt man in a Wehrmacht greatcoat, whispered, "You shouldn't have come. They're hanging people for less than a word now." "I've been hanged before," Yeo-Thomas said grimly. "I'm looking for anyone who still wants Germany to live after Hitler dies." The man studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "There's one, a general, von Gersdorf. He's hiding under a false name near the Tiergarten. He tried to kill Hitler once." Yeo-Thomas knew the name. Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf, the officer who had nearly blown himself up beside the Führer in 1943, only to have Hitler leave the room early. A man who had spent the rest of the war pretending to be loyal, waiting for another chance. 2 nights later, Yeo-Thomas found himself in a cellar lit by a single candle. Von Gersdorf sat opposite him, his uniform stripped of insignia, his hair graying. "So, the British still send ghosts to walk our ruins," the general said, his voice low but steady. "I'm no ghost," Yeo-Thomas replied. "Not yet." Von Gersdorf smiled faintly. "We are all ghosts now, Mr. Delaunay. Berlin is nothing but ashes wearing uniforms." They talked for hours. The general spoke of what was left of the German army. Thousands of boys pressed into hopeless defense. The madness of the SS. The suicides spreading through command posts. He told Yeo-Thomas of officers desperate to surrender, but terrified of being shot by their own men or delivered to the Soviets. "What do you want from me?" he finally asked. "Names," Yeo-Thomas said. "Documents. Anything that proves to London which of you can still be trusted when the guns stop." Von Gersdorff hesitated, then slid a small envelope across the table. "Here. They're already dead men, but their families will live longer if the Allies know they weren't all monsters." Yeo-Thomas pocketed it. "And you?" "I will stay. Someone must bury what's left of Prussia." When Yeo-Thomas left the cellar, the streets were alive with sirens. Allied bombers had returned, streaking the night sky with fire. He ran through the blackened streets as the city shuddered under explosions. The smell of smoke clung to everything: hair, skin, memory. He reached an abandoned tram shelter and ducked inside, clutching the envelope against his chest. In the flicker of the fires outside, he read the names scrawled in von Gersdorff's handwriting. Officers from the Wehrmacht High Command, members of the Foreign Office, even an SS logistics officer claiming to have information on the camps. Each name was a seed of survival, or a death warrant, depending on who found them first. Yeo-Thomas closed the envelope. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who had seen too much of humanity's rot and still believed in its chance for redemption. Outside, the night burned red. The Soviets were coming. Time was running out. He whispered again to himself, in the dark shelter of a dying city. This is what's left of civilization, a man writing names while the world ends. Tomorrow he would have to find a way out, or die with the ghosts of Berlin. The city was no longer a city. It was a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, where trust could kill you faster than a bullet. By March 1945, Berlin had become a graveyard of loyalties. Yeo-Thomas, the man the Gestapo once nicknamed the White Rabbit, knew that every conversation, every footstep, could be the last sound he'd ever hear. He moved like smoke through the ruins, sleeping in basements, trading cigarettes for scraps of bread. His French papers still held up under inspection, but the Gestapo had begun tightening its net, searching for foreign agents exploiting the chaos. The irony was almost laughable. In a city already devouring itself, they still hunted phantoms. On the third day after his meeting with von Gersdorff, Yeo-Thomas found himself standing outside what used to be the Hotel Adlon, once the pride of Berlin, now a shell with curtains of dust hanging where chandeliers used to glow. He had arranged to meet another contact, a woman named Hilde Weiss, once a secretary for the Abwehr, now part of the underground courier chain moving information to Sweden. She appeared from the alleyway wrapped in a gray coat, her face thin, eyes darting with the nervous sharpness of prey. "You're late," she hissed. "Hard to find a taxi in this city," he replied, offering a faint smile. She didn't laugh. "They're hanging people on lampposts now. For talking, for looking wrong, for existing." He followed her inside, through the skeleton of the hotel. The marble floors were cracked, glass glittered underfoot. They descended into the old wine cellar, now a bunker of secrets. She laid out a stack of papers, maps, coded telegrams, ration lists, all scavenged from the chaos of the collapsing Reich. "These," she said, "are from what's left of the Foreign Office. They're planning to destroy every record before the Soviets arrive. But there's something else, something you need to hear." She hesitated, then leaned close. "The Gestapo knows about you. They say a British agent has been seen in the Western districts, a man using a French name, always asking questions about surrender. They call you the man in the gray coat." Yeo-Thomas's jaw tightened. He knew what came next. "When they start giving you a name," he said quietly, "they're already writing your file." He had to move again. That night, he slipped through Tiergarten, the once grand park now cratered by bombs and littered with twisted iron. He carried Hilda's documents under his coat, proof that fragments of Germany were trying to survive the Reich's suicide. The sound of marching boots broke the silence. He froze behind a fallen statue. Through the skeletal trees, he saw the Gestapo patrol. 3 men, flashlights cutting through the mist. He waited. One of the beams swept close, lingering on the ground just inches from his foot. Then, a shout. "Halt!" He ran. Bullets cracked through the air, biting into the trees. He darted across an open field, lungs burning, heart hammering. A shell crater appeared ahead. He dove in, rolling into the mud. Above him, flashlights danced wildly through the smoke. He reached into his pocket, the small cyanide capsule pressing against his fingers. The last resort. If captured, he'd never talk. He'd already endured the Gestapo's torture once in Paris, before escaping their clutches through a prison transfer meant for the dead. He'd sworn never again. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done testing him. The patrol's voices grew fainter. Minutes passed. Then silence, only the distant hum of planes. He climbed out of the crater and stumbled toward the western edge of the city, where a gutted factory offered refuge. Inside, by the light of a dying candle, he finally unfurled the papers Hilda had given him. Among the maps and coded memos was a letter marked with the seal of Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo himself. The message was chilling. All records regarding foreign intelligence operations, special prisoners, and Allied agents to be consolidated and burned at once. Priority targets include captured SOE personnel, escaped detainees, and known saboteurs. At the bottom of the list, written in ink, was a name: Thomas, F.F.E. He stared at it for a long moment, the candle flickering against his face. So they still remembered. They still wanted him. Even here, even now, when Berlin was already on fire. He crushed the letter in his fist. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," he muttered. That night, he sent a coded message to London through his hidden radio, disguised as a field broadcast from the ruins of a Luftwaffe outpost. Blue Fox reporting. Berlin crumbling. Resistance contacts active. Gestapo aware. Mission compromised but ongoing. Will attempt extraction via Tiergarten zone. Request immediate confirmation. God save the king. The reply came hours later, through static and thunder. Blue Fox acknowledged. No extraction possible. Complete objective. Survive if you can. He sat there for a long while after that, staring at the radio. The phrase "survive if you can" wasn't an order. It was an epitaph. Outside, the night roared with artillery. Berlin was burning from every direction. Yeo-Thomas rose, tucked the coded documents into his jacket, and whispered to the empty room, "This isn't about survival anymore. It's about finishing the damn job." And then he disappeared again, into the black veins of the dying capital, to fight the war that no one would ever write medals for. Berlin was howling, not just from the bombs that fell every night, but from something deeper, a kind of madness that had seeped into every street, every whisper, every pair of frightened eyes. As dawn broke over the broken skyline, Yeo-Thomas, the White Rabbit, made his way through the wreckage of Leipziger Strasse, his breath misting in the cold spring air. The streets were lined with burned-out trams, bodies covered with rags, and the occasional Nazi officer still clinging to an illusion of order. He carried no weapon except a small pistol and his forged French papers. In his coat, the documents he'd taken from Hilda Weiss, maps, messages, and one phrase that haunted him: Project Werewolf. It was whispered among the dying hierarchy, a desperate last plan by the SS to continue the war through underground cells, assassinations, and sabotage after Germany fell. A phantom army that would rise from the ashes. If true, it meant that surrender wouldn't end the killing. It would only make it invisible. And so on that gray morning, Yeo-Thomas's new mission was clear: find the Wolf's Den, the rumored command post coordinating this final plan, and destroy its network before the world woke to another kind of war. He found his way to a half-ruined brewery near the Spree River, one of the few places in Berlin still functioning as a meeting hub for the resistance. Inside, men and women sat in the dim light, their faces hollow from hunger and fear. A familiar voice called his name. "Thomas!" It was von Gersdorff, the disillusioned Wehrmacht officer who had once tried to blow up Hitler himself. His uniform was gone now, replaced by a ragged coat. But the sharpness in his eyes remained. "You shouldn't be here," he said, leading Yeo-Thomas to a back room. "The Gestapo are tearing through the city. They've already executed 2 of my couriers. They're always tearing through something, Yeo-Thomas replied dryly. You mentioned before you might know who's behind this werewolf plan. Von Gersdorff nodded. He spread a hand-drawn map across the table. Here. The SS has set up a communications bunker under the Ministry of Aviation, Göring's old headquarters. It's being used by a unit reporting directly to Martin Bormann. They're transmitting coded orders to cells across southern Germany and Czechoslovakia. Yeo-Thomas studied the map. The bunker was heavily guarded. Suicide to go in alone. He looked up. You've been there? Once, said Gersdorff. Long enough to see that they're expecting an Allied infiltration. They're preparing to destroy the archives when the Russians breach the city. Yeo-Thomas exhaled. Then we have to get there before they do. Gersdorff shook his head. You don't understand, my friend. That place is the wolf's den. Everyone inside is loyal to the death. You won't walk out alive. The Englishman gave a thin, humorless smile. I didn't come here to walk out. That night, under a sky lit red by artillery, Yeo-Thomas and Gersdorff made their way through the ruins toward Wilhelmstrasse, where the Luftwaffe building still stood amid crumbling stone. They carried forged passes and a single suitcase filled with stolen explosives. Each step echoed with the knowledge that if they were caught, there would be no trial, only a bullet and a pit. As they approached the side entrance, 2 SS guards stopped them. Papers, one barked. Gersdorff handed them over. The guard's flashlight swept across the document, then paused on Yeo-Thomas's face. You're French? Yes, he said calmly, in perfect Parisian German. Assigned to assist the communications office. I bring orders from the Chancellery. The guard hesitated, then nodded them through. The door creaked open, swallowing them into the darkness. Inside, the air smelled of oil, sweat, and fear. Radios crackled. Officers shouted over the noise. Typewriters clattered with the last gasps of a dying empire. They descended a stairwell into the underground level. The bunker. Yeo-Thomas's heart pounded as he counted 3 guards at the far end. A locked room, 2 operators manning a transmitter, and a large metal crate beside them, stamped with the eagle insignia. He knew what it was. The werewolf archives. He nodded to Gersdorff. They moved quickly. A distraction first, a thrown wrench clanging down the corridor. One of the guards went to investigate. Yeo-Thomas struck the second from behind with his pistol, while Gersdorff seized the third, silencing him before he could cry out. They worked fast, setting charges along the transmitter's base and around the archive crate. The explosives were crude but effective. British ingenuity in a German nightmare. As Gersdorff armed the detonator, a voice echoed from behind them. Halt! Hände hoch! 2 more SS men had appeared at the stairwell, guns raised. Gersdorff turned and was shot. The impact threw him against the wall. Yeo-Thomas fired back, dropping one of the soldiers, but the other lunged forward. They struggled in the flickering light, the detonator slipping from his hand. A fist slammed into his jaw. He reeled back. The SS man drew a knife. English swine, he snarled. We know who you are. Yeo-Thomas ducked under the blade, drove his shoulder into the man's chest, and twisted his arm until the knife clattered away. A single shot ended it. He turned back to Gersdorff. Blood stained his uniform, dark and heavy. Finish it, the German whispered, pressing the detonator into Yeo-Thomas's palm. End it before they rise again. Yeo-Thomas hesitated, just for a heartbeat. Then he nodded. He dragged Gersdorff's body to safety, pulled the fuse wire taut, and ran for the stairs. The explosion tore through the bunker, a roar that shook the earth. Flames licked the ceiling as debris rained down. He stumbled into the street, coughing through smoke, the sky above him split by fire. Behind him, the wolf's den burned. The werewolf archives were gone. The Phantom Army would never rise. Yeo-Thomas looked back once, at the inferno that had consumed so many secrets, and whispered to the man who had fallen beside him, You did it, Gersdorff. You killed the wolves. Then he vanished again into the ruins, just another shadow among millions. Berlin was dying. By April 1945, the city was little more than a graveyard of stone and smoke. The streets ran with the sickly orange light of fires that never went out. Tanks groaned through the rubble like prehistoric beasts, crushing memories under their treads. And somewhere in that chaos, a man with no country left to claim him was running out of time. Yeo-Thomas, the British spy known to the SOE as the White Rabbit, had survived the unthinkable. He had seen the inside of Buchenwald, escaped the Gestapo, and burned down the Nazi werewolf archives with his own hands. But the mission wasn't over. He still had one task left: to tell London what had happened before Berlin fell completely into Soviet hands. He moved carefully through the ruins near Potsdamer Platz, guided by memory more than sight. Allied bombers had flattened the area weeks before, and the once grand district was now a maze of twisted metal and crumbling facades. Somewhere beneath the rubble of a collapsed post office was a small radio room, a forgotten hub once used by German intelligence. If he could get it working, he could reach London, but the Gestapo was still out there. Remnants of men who refused to surrender, still clinging to the idea of a Reich that no longer existed. They had seen their comrades burned alive in the bunker explosion. They knew a foreign agent was behind it, and they were hunting him with the desperation of cornered wolves. Every sound in the ruins made Yeo-Thomas's hand tighten on his pistol. Every step could be his last. He ducked through a blown-out archway, stepping over a body half buried in snow and soot. The uniform was SS, the face unrecognizable. "War's over for you," he muttered under his breath. Inside the ruins, he found the old communications room. The walls were cracked, wires hung from the ceiling like vines. But miraculously, the transmitter was still there. An old Lorenz machine, its panels dented but intact. He went to work. Years of field training had taught him to improvise. He found a broken lamp for parts, stripped the wiring, reconnected the circuits. Each turn of the dial brought the faint hum of life. Outside, artillery rumbled closer. The Soviets were crossing the Spree. He knew he didn't have long. He tapped out the first signal, using the emergency frequency. White Rabbit to London Control. Priority 1. For a long moment there was only static. Then, a faint reply crackled through. "Control to White Rabbit. We read you. Confirm status." Yeo-Thomas leaned close to the microphone. "Mission complete. Werewolf archives destroyed. Berlin falling. Repeat. Berlin falling. Allied operatives in city compromised. Casualties heavy. Code files eliminated." The line went dead for a few seconds. Then, "Understood. Extraction not possible. Proceed to neutral zone if able. Godspeed." He stared at the radio, jaw tight. Extraction not possible. He'd known it would come to this, but hearing it, the finality of it, still cut deep. A sound behind him made him freeze. Boots. He turned slowly, pistol raised. Two figures stood in the doorway. One Gestapo, the other a teenage conscript in a ragged uniform. The older man's face was pale and furious, his pistol already aimed. "So," the Gestapo officer sneered, "the English rat who thinks he can burn down Germany." Yeo-Thomas didn't answer. His finger rested on the trigger, his mind cold and clear. "You think this city will die with us?" The German spat. "We'll come back. The Reich never ends." Yeo-Thomas almost smiled. "You already ended it yourself." He fired first. The officer fell, the echo swallowed by the thunder of distant shellfire. The boy ran, no fight left in him. Smoke drifted through the shattered windows. The Soviets were close now. The sound of tank treads growing louder, the cries of civilians echoing through the night. Yeo-Thomas looked down at the transmitter one last time. The light on the console flickered, a faint heartbeat of connection to a world beyond the ruins. He reached for the mic again. "This is the last transmission from Berlin," he said softly. "The wolves are gone. The city is finished. Tell them, we did what we came to do." Then he turned off the set. Hours later, Soviet troops entered the sector. They found the room half destroyed, walls blackened by fire. Among the wreckage was the shattered radio, and beside it, a small notebook. burned around the edges, but legible. In it were only 3 words, scrawled in pencil. Mission accomplished. Free. Yeo-Thomas truly existed. A British SOE agent, he endured capture, torture, and imprisonment in Buchenwald before escaping and returning to Allied lines. Though this episode is fictionalized, it's inspired by his real missions behind enemy lines. A man who lived through hell and returned to tell the world what he'd seen. London, 1945. The war was ending, but for Wing Commander Forrest Frederick Edward Yeo-Thomas, the silence that followed the guns was heavier than the explosions ever were. He walked through Whitehall like a ghost in daylight, alive, yes, but hollowed out from within. The medals pinned to his chest meant nothing compared to the memories buried behind his eyes. Everyone wanted to hear about the missions, the escapes, the coded messages, the explosions behind enemy lines. They called him the White Rabbit, a nickname whispered through the corridors of SOE headquarters with awe. But no one really wanted to hear about the camps, no. One wanted to hear about the smell or the faces, or the way he could still hear the dogs barking when he closed his eyes at night. The morning after his debriefing, Yeo-Thomas sat in a small office overlooking the Thames. Rain pattered against the windows, blurring the gray skyline of post-war London. Across from him sat Major Hargreaves, an MI5 liaison who had known him before the war, back when he was just another civil servant with a sharp tongue and an unshakable sense of duty. "You should write it down," Hargreaves said quietly. "Everything you saw. Every name you remember." Yeo-Thomas took a long drag of his cigarette. "You think words can capture that place?" "Maybe not," the major replied. "But the truth dies if you don't." There was a long pause. Outside, Big Ben struck 11. "All right," Yeo-Thomas said finally, "but not for history. For the men who didn't walk out." The first weeks of peace were chaos. Buchenwald was liberated by the Americans, and when Allied intelligence began cataloging its horrors, they were shocked to find a living SOE operative among the survivors. Barely alive. Unrecognizable, but alive. The report described him as emaciated, but mentally alert. He had refused immediate medical evacuation until he could confirm the identities of other prisoners. French resistance fighters, Polish officers, and Jewish inmates who had aided his escape. He was the only British agent to ever escape a concentration camp and survive to testify about it. In May 1945, Yeo-Thomas stood before a military tribunal in Paris as part of the war crimes documentation effort. The room was filled with stenographers, Allied officers, and representatives of the French resistance. The air smelled of dust and cigarette smoke. He spoke for 3 hours. He described the beatings, the interrogations, the sound of boots on concrete in the Buchenwald courtyard, the lists of names called at dawn, the crematorium smoke that hung over the camp like a permanent dusk. At one point, his voice cracked, but he didn't stop. When he finished, the French magistrate in charge of the proceedings stood and removed his glasses. His eyes were wet. "Commander," he said softly, "France will not forget the White Rabbit." Back in London, his life didn't return to normal, because it couldn't. He worked with the Special Operations Executive's disbanding team, ensuring that hundreds of secret agents received recognition, pensions, and proper memorials. He attended funerals for those who never came home. Men and women who had died under code names the world would never know. Sometimes he visited Brookwood Military Cemetery, where many SOE agents were buried under simple stones. He would walk among the graves, reading the carved names aloud under his breath. Vera Atkins, Odette Sansom, Violette Sabo. Names that had once been ink on mission files, now carved in marble. He never stopped feeling responsible for them. In 1946, Yeo-Thomas was invited to Buckingham Palace. King George VI awarded him the George Cross, Britain's highest award for gallantry not in direct combat. The citation read, "For outstanding courage, endurance, and devotion to duty in circumstances of the greatest danger." As the medal was pinned to his chest, Yeo-Thomas bowed slightly, but inside, He felt only the weight of the ghosts that would never leave him. Later, in an interview with the Daily Telegraph, he said quietly, "I am no hero. I merely did what I believed was right. The heroes are those who never came back." The years passed. The world moved on, as it always does, but in the quiet corners of history, Yeo-Thomas's name endured. In the archives of Buchenwald, his testimony helped convict dozens of guards and SS officers during the Nuremberg follow-up trials. His files became training material for future intelligence officers, a grim reminder of what the world becomes when silence replaces courage. In 1964, when he died in France at the age of 62, the London Times obituary began simply, "A man who knew both the worst and the best of humanity." He was buried near Paris, under the simple inscription F.F.E. Yeo-Thomas, G.C., M.C. Croix de Guerre, 1912-1964. The White Rabbit. And so ends the story of the man who talked to devils and still believed in angels, the spy who defied the Gestapo, the prisoner who refused to die, the man who walked out of the fire, carrying the truth with him.